But first tonight, Albanese accused of a broken promise over his government's pledge to hold a royal commission into the pandemic response. Today, the Prime Minister announced a COVID inquiry that would exclude decisions made by the states and territories and would report within a year. This is despite previously pledging that the states would be part of any royal commission-like inquiry. But now Albanese says including the states and having a royal commission would all take too long.
Because I promised one royal commission as leader of the Labor Party. That was into robo-debt, and that has reported and has been effective. One of the things we've learned about royal commissions is that they can roll on and on and on for year after year after year. We've learnt that with the Royal Commission into veterans issues has been extended.
Now, these are the three experts the Prime Minister has appointed to lead the inquiry, and two of the three of them supported hard lockdowns. The Australian reported this afternoon that panel member Angela Jackson said in July 2021 that Victoria needed a hard lockdown and a dose of luck to get through this. And a fellow panel member and epidemiologist, Catherine Bennett, was also publicly supportive of Melbourne's lockdowns. Is it possible then that these three experts appointed by the government can really objectively and in an unbiased fashion judge what went on during the pandemic? And as for excluding the states, well, if Albanese's intention is to hold an inquiry into the COVID response, you cannot possibly separate the decisions made by the states from those made by Canberra. There was a national cabinet. The state and federal decisions were intertwined. But the main decisions about lockdowns and mandates were all made by premiers. Albanese denied this amounted to a broken promise today. So let's have a look at exactly what the Prime Minister did promise before the election and in the months afterwards. Well, as we were about to head to the polls on May the 6th last year, Albanese himself said he wanted a measure like a royal commission. Have a listen.
I cannot envisage a situation in which whoever wins government wouldn't want to examine the once-in-a-century pandemic and the response. You have to do so. We have to examine it so that we learn the lessons, not as a political exercise, although some of it undoubtedly would be political.
And in that comments, in those press conferences, he said a measure like a royal commission. Then in August last year, just 3 months later, Albanese still indicated he planned to include the states in an inquiry. Have a look.
When asked about this last week, you were asked whether there would be a broader royal commission into COVID. You signalled there would be. That is the response to COVID. I'm wondering when you were thinking of calling that, and would that contain examination of the practices of state and federal governments during the pandemic, or just the federal government?
Well, clearly you'd need to look at the response of all governments. Primarily, it would be about the federal government. That's what we have responsibility for. But the interaction between the different levels of government, of course, were critical to the response to the COVID pandemic.
He backed in a royal commission when asked about it just a week before that interview with Nine's then political editor, Chris Uhlmann.
Are you going to call a royal commission into this so Australians know exactly what was going on?
I've said consistently that once we were through the pandemic, it would be inconceivable, regardless of who won the election in May, that you would not have a proper examination of the circumstances around the handling of the pandemic, importantly, so that you could prepare any lessons from it.
The opposition now argue this is a clear broken promise because Albanese had always implied that there would be a royal commission or an inquiry with similar powers that would examine all decisions made during the pandemic. But today, Albanese said this.
What do you think a royal commission could do that this couldn't do? Nothing. There's been a change of government in 2 of the states, and at the time of the pandemic, there were 3 Liberal premiers in states and 3 Labor premiers. This should not be a source of conflict.
Senior Cabinet Minister Katy Gallagher was the chair of the Senate Select Committee on COVID set up in 2020. And this committee, it was Katy Gallagher's recommendation, officially and formally called for a royal commission. It said the committee recommends that a royal commission be established to examine Australia's response to the COVID pandemic, to inform preparedness for future COVID waves and future pandemics. Again, that was a Labor recommendation, not one from the coalition. And Health Minister Mark Butler had also said the states should be scrutinised as part of this inquiry. These next comments from June last year, 1 month after the federal election.
Once we start to reach a phase in the pandemic where it is appropriate to start to look back rather than focus on the challenges of the day, then we'll have that. We'll reach out to clinicians. Obviously, state governments are critically important in this process, and we'll start to set up a proper evidence-based inquiry.
So you heard him say there that the states will be critically important in this process. Let's just hear that line again.
Obviously, state governments are critically important in this process, and we'll start to set up a proper evidence-based inquiry.
State governments critically important in this process. Butler was clear that this would be a royal commission or something extremely similar. Have a look.
There will be a time, as I think I've said before, for a proper inquiry into the country's response to this pandemic, whether that's a royal commission, as was recommended by the Senate committee, or some other very deep inquiry, and that will examine all of our responses.
He said it would be unthinkable not to have a royal commission or something with similar powers. Well, today then, the unthinkable happened. And Peter Dutton was brutal in his response to Albanese's rewriting of history.
Premiers who were responsible for lockdowns, the very significant numbers of deaths in Victoria, the mental health issues that still linger today in Victoria and elsewhere are as a result of Daniel Andrews' decisions, and that he would be excluded from consideration in this inquiry. I think Australians are smart enough to smell a rat here, and the Prime Minister has made a decision which is not in our national interest, and it goes against what he promised to the Australian public, and it's obviously been rolled out this week as a giant distraction to the disasters around energy and the voice.
In any case, it's nonsensical to exclude the states from any inquiry because it was the states that made all the decisions that are essential to examine for future pandemics. It was the state premiers that held the power over lockdowns, mandates, border closures and so on. So let's look at exactly who benefits from not examining the decisions by the states. Out of all the premiers and leaders who are in charge during the pandemic, only 2 remain: Anastasia Palaszczuk in Queensland and Daniel Andrews in Victoria. And Queensland would be heading to the polls shortly after this inquiry is due to hand down its report. Daniel Andrews, for one, will be relieved that he's managed to escape scrutiny over the decisions he made that we now know were influenced by opinion polls. And here he was today, antagonistic as always towards the media.
I think everybody regrets having to go through a 1 in 100 year pandemic where people lost their lives and where our lives were turned upside down. Whether it be, what improvements can we make to the national medical stockpile? Can we avoid, if we need again, not having enough vaccines when we need them?
Will your government and ministers cooperate with the inquiry?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the nature of this is going to be. I'm not sure whether it's going to have hearings or take submissions, but again, we'll wait and see what the Prime Minister announces.
Scott Morrison says anything short of a Royal Commission would be obsolete because it couldn't compel current and former state officials. Has the Prime Minister done you a favour potentially by...
No, and I'm not here to respond to anything that Scott Morrison says. The people of Australia have passed their judgement on him.
Well, Bridget McKenzie, the National Senate leader, last night said it was essential that the states be part of this inquiry.
Well, it's another broken promise by Anthony Albanese. He went to the election promising a royal commission. They ran a select committee in the Senate throughout COVID, hearing from experts for, over a year. They heard from a wide range of experts right across the country. And out of that inquiry, they decided they would have a Royal Commission. Now, they're not delivering a Royal Commission. And there's only one reason why, Sharri, and it's because a Royal Commission into COVID would have to look at National Cabinet, would have to look at how that functioned to keep us all safe through a global pandemic, but then look at the different jurisdictions' reactions. And that means seriously examining the actions of Premier Daniel Andrews in my home state of Victoria, where we were locked in our houses, where we're still dealing with the mental health outcomes, particularly for our young people, and the behaviour of Anastasia Palaszczuk when she slammed shut that border between New South Wales and Queensland and people couldn't deliver babies.
Now, if you're a regular viewer and happened to be watching this program last night, you'll know that I spent around 13 minutes speaking about this very issue and indicated that this is where Albanese was headed, that he was on track to hold a commission of inquiry, but not a royal commission. There are rumblings that Albanese may announce a judicial inquiry that only examines the former coalition government's response. Now, the advantage of a royal commission is that it would compel the states to participate, but a judicial inquiry wouldn't have that power. That's just one of the reasons you need to watch this program to be ahead of the news. But as I said last night, how can the Albanese government truly argue that a royal commission into the robo-debt scheme is more important than a royal commission into the handling of the COVID pandemic, when the pandemic affected every single Australian? This is, without question, the most consequential period of our history, the most life-changing since World War II, the first pandemic in a century. Schools were closed, children developed mental health disorders, suicide rates went up, businesses shut down, workers who had only ever known a regular salary joined long unemployment queues, and jobs dried up. Entire industries were at their knees. And then at the individual level, personal freedoms were stripped away as we succumbed to a police authoritarian state without even questioning it. And those who did question it, like pregnant mother Zoe Bueller in Melbourne, was arrested in her home in front of her young children. There was no sitting on park benches, no picnics, no walking on the beach, no cafes, no mingling, no hugging, no socialising. It was complete isolation. Families and friends couldn't visit each other's homes, and there were curfews in some states. All of these decisions need to be examined. The unvaccinated and the unmasked were officially ostracised from society and workplaces, based on advice that we now know is flawed or at the very least questionable. The need for an inquiry into our handling of this pandemic isn't about politics. It isn't about blaming Dan Andrews or Scott Morrison or anyone. It's about finding the best practice for future pandemics. It's essential that we learn and heed the lessons from this pandemic and develop a set of recommendations for future governments and society. It's also about the interaction between the states and Canberra, and there could very well be constitutional recommendations as well. As Mark Butler originally said, it is simply unthinkable not to have a proper royal commission or similar inquiry into all that unfolded. And not including decisions made by the states just to protect them for political reasons is appalling. And it says more about Albanese's own political judgement than anything else. This will, once again, cost him and the entire Labor government. Today's broken promise to hold a COVID inquiry that won't examine decisions made by the states when you can't separate the state responses from our national handling of the pandemic, they're inseparable. In terms of broken promises, none is more egregious than this, and it's a sentiment that Peter Dutton agreed with today.
It should be a Royal Commission. There's no question about that. But let's be honest what's happened here. The letters patent weren't supported by Daniel Andrews and Anastasia Palaszczuk, and now you've got this concocted story from a desperate Prime Minister who's telling you that An inquiry should only go up to the period that he was elected.